Well, first things first, ja, ish, Brian Young, in Asia, touching the Schlingo, something but just chain, total cheating the Dasha, total conscious additional, I could take off his teen initially. Said so then Nashangi DJ Brooklyn, Michigan. Hi everyone, my name is Brian Young, and I just said my four Navajo clans. I'm originally from the Fort Defiant Sawmill area of Arizona, but I currently live in Brooklyn. And yeah, my path to publication took many years. I originally graduated my undergrad with a bachelor's of arts in film study, and when I graduated it was like 2010. Wow, that's a while ago. Um, so I moved to Albuquerque with the hopes and dreams of working in the then kind of blossoming native film industry. Like a lot of native film directors and creative people were living in Albuquerque. So when I moved there, it was my hopes to kind of bust into that scene and just start writing my scripts, start, making my own films with the native film directors there. And then Susanna Martinez happened. She was the then governor elect, and she got rid of a bunch of film incentives. And so that was the only thing kind of tying all those film companies to Albuquerque. Because at that time, like that was when the huge block burst of film in Albuquerque was occurring, such as like the first Marvel films like Thor, Iron Man were being filmed there, Breaking Bad, In Plain Sight. So there's just a bunch of exciting opportunities. But when the film incentives left, so did all the film production companies. And so I was stuck there, and well, I shouldn't say stuck. I lived there um, without any kind of fallback, and me and the other native filmmakers, like we were donating our time to each other's projects, and we were constantly trying to get our own films, our own stories produced, directed, and we were constantly pitching to film executives, and they were always telling us like there's no market for native voices, there's no market for native films, so we're not going to back you. It was either that or you need to make your main characters white, so that way we can attach a big name white actor to it, or make your main character half white so a white actor could play that role. And that was like 10 years ago, and thankfully that kind of mindset is slowly shifting away from that racist mindset.
Right.
I initially started writing Healer of the Water Monster as a feature-length script.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I had that dream that eventually would be the final chapter and of that little boy running through a cornfield and out into a desert, and then running into a little lizard, and they both started singing, and it started raining. So I initially started writing Healer as a feature-length script, and I just hated writing it. It was just such a huge
Really?
source of stress and headaches and anxiety because I knew that I would be encountering those same prejudiced notions of no one watching native films, and I knew that that was what's going to happen with this story. So it's just like very downtrodden, very disheartened, and like not wanting to finish it. But this is also around the time when like there were tons of book to film adaptations. Like Hunger Games was still going strong. Twilight, for whatever reason, was very popular, and Harry Potter was just kind of wrapping up. So I decided to kind of pivot and write it as a book.
Mm.
But I had no idea how to write. I knew how to write scripts and everything, but prose writing is very, very different. And so I decided to get my MFA, and that's the long story of it. Got my MFA, and thankfully I graduated with a publishing contract with HarperCollins through the imprint Heart Drum. I've always gravitated towards writing because I felt like that's where the true power of storytelling is. Um, I did some acting while I was doing filmmaking stuff in Albuquerque, but I always kind of hated the roles that I was auditioning for because it was always like stereotypes, and they were
Right.
asking me to wear wigs and wear loincloths, and like we aren't in the past, we exist today, and the few roles that were contemporary always went to the same few actors, and I'm glad for them and their success that they've built on those roles, but it was always just like so very few slim pickings of contemporary native roles that I was auditioning for, and they always went to the same actors.
Right.
So I was eager to pivot to a different industry, to the publishing industry. I was excited. I knew that there was a tension that Healer of the Water Monster as the kind of like, I want to say the second or third draft. So I wrote it first draft in just a flurry of like 3 months. Um, I knew that it was going to take work. I knew that it was going to take time, and I revised and edited it. And then I did another revision. I want to say it's either the second or third revision when I went to hashtag DVPit. So on back then it was known as Twitter, and I got the attention of like 50 literary agents.
Wow.
And that kind of spurred me to really dedicate all my effort and time and energy to this story. They all said no to representing me, but just the fact that 50 literary agents were interested in reading the premise of a young Navajo boy finding a Navajo holy being motivated me to continue down this path.
That's great. Well, and so where did the inspiration for the story come from?
It initially started as a dream. I had a dream when I was working as a meat cutter in Albuquerque to pay bills. And I was a young Navajo boy. I knew he was Navajo. He was playing with then, it was like a 3DS, but in the book, it's his smartphone. So he's playing with his 3DS, and then he just stops for whatever reason, and then he runs out into nearby desert. And in my mind, I grew up in like the Sawmill Fort Defiance area, and I go to Noslini with my grandparents where we have cattle. So that desert to me was always kind of Noslini, where it's just like one of the most remote locations in the United States. Beautiful, beautiful, colorful sands and everything. So he runs out there, and then he finds a little lizard, and the both of them just started to sing, and then it just started raining around them. And just that image really, really stuck with me of like a young Navajo boy. He's wearing jeans, he's wearing a shirt, very contemporary, interacting with technology, the 3DS, but then going out and singing what then I assume to be a traditional Navajo rain song, and it started to rain. So this young Navajo boy was that bridge between the contemporary and the traditional, and he was existing so freely and so lovingly in that space, and like I wanted to write that. So when I was writing it as a feature length script, again, I hated it. But when I switched to writing it as a book, like I just was so motivated, and that's why it only took me like 3 months. It was all bad prose, I'll admit, but I had that fire in me again. I had that desire to just not be at work and be in front of my computer, just pumping it out.
And then fast forward to now, you have the latest Heroes of the Water Monster come out. And I wanted to talk about something you mentioned, is that you said there's this moment that happens for every Native child that's usually overlooked, but something every Native child goes through when they realize they're descended from survivors.
Yeah, so that moment that I feel is very, very unique to Native children is that moment when we discover that, for me, it was that I had ancestors who survived the long walk, our forced relocation, and that all Native children have to at some point come to that realization that they are descendants of people who've been relocated, who have survived genocide, those many decades ago, and that violence is often overlooked, that those atrocities are forgotten. And when I was a kid, my mom told me my ancestors' survival story of the Long Walk era when I was 11. And I remember it very, very clearly because she pointed at this playground that I used to play at as a kid, like me and my friends. Like it was this kind of Baptist church place, and like it was the only place with the playground. So we'd go there, sneak onto it, and just like play for hours on end. And then she said that's one of the areas where they held us captive, where they held us prisoners. And so it was literally just like I was playing on an area where massacre was occurring, where rampant crimes were happening. And so it was a very subdued experience then, because I had my family around me, and it helped me kind of like navigate those emotions. But my experiences of the United States drastically changed. everything that I had been told that, the United States is the land of the free, we have all these amazing, beautiful promises of living in the United States. But then my ancestors were the ones to suffer for those promises, that their blood was the foundation of which that was built. So it didn't really manifest in me until I was more of an adult. When I left my reservation and went into undergraduates, where I was like, went from a minority, from being the majority on my reservation to being a minority, when I really started having those conflicting feelings of like, you all don't know the history.
Right.
That's frustrating. It's very, very, very angering to see that you guys are celebrating the 4th of July, that you're celebrating the Thanksgiving myth, and not putting any effort to learning the history. So I wanted to give that experience some attention, because again, like, there are no books on how to deal with that, how Native parents can introduce their children to that experience of, learning that they are survivors or descendants of survivors. At least for me, the way I envisioned it was, this is always kind of meant to be the starting point, the starting discussion of saying, this is what's happening. Native kids are experiencing this very important moment when they're recontextualizing the United States and the world around them. It has to be studied. It has to be looked into, because that can manifest in many, many years later as anger, as dependency issues as well. I mean, there are a whole list of reasons why Native Americans have the highest rates of dependency issues, substance abuse issues, and mental health disorders. And I believe that this is definitely one of those reasons.
Yeah, and love that. I love that you talk about that in your book, and also in the first book, Killer the Water Monster. You have the uncle who's often also grappling with his own issues after serving in the military. So you take on some really big issues in this book, and this is for middle grade. Was it hard to figure out kind of how to tell the story that it wasn't talking down to them, but it wasn't overwhelming them either when you talk about these big issues?
I had no fear whatsoever when discussing these issues, because this was stuff I was experiencing as a kid. Uncle Jet's alcoholism is a very common experience on the reservation, and I believe this may be paraphrasing like really old research, but I believe like the alcohol dependency rates is often like 2/3. And I had 6 uncles, and only 2 of them were, I don't want to say non-alcoholic, but at least like functioning adults who weren't suffering alcohol dependency. So those were very real lived experiences of seeing those rates in action, of seeing my uncles drinking. And like, I was actually 11 years old when I had to drive them home because they were just way too drunk to drive. And that was one of my very first driving experiences, but also seeing like depression and unfortunately suicidality and all that occur in my life. So I didn't feel the need to kind of like dumb it down, as it would be called, because again, like, this is stuff that I was experiencing as a kid. And for me, my primary target audience was always young Navajo kids. Mm-hmm. I always felt that other kids have stories written for them, but there was nothing for Navajo kids. And that's kind of why in my dedication for the first book, it's like for young Navajos who are searching for themselves in books. And thankfully, my editor and agents, like, they were very welcoming to that story. They did not provide any feedback or pushback saying like, you need to make it a little more ambiguous of what's happening. It's like, no, like, if we're going to talk about this, we're going to talk about this because Native kids experience this. If there was one thing I think about writing those kind of more adult issues that young reader literature should address, is how to navigate it and how to seek answers for it. And so that's why the end of Uncle Jet's storyline is like, he is not enlisted or enrolled. he is hospitalized in a suicide prevention watch, and he does get those resources that he needs. And there's a list of I don't think there was a list, but it does mention the prevention suicide hotline for veterans.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my way of not only presenting this issue that Native kids, Navajo kids would experience, but also saying this is a potential resource and avenue for you to address it if you need help.
Right. I love that you include that. Like you said, this is like helping kids know how to, one, that they're not alone, but also what do they do with all of these emotions and these issues that they're having to face at such a young age. And so like you said, this was written primarily for young Navajo kids, but as you know, it has a wider audience. So I was really curious about the inclusion of the Dene language in it, because and it was really interesting. I loved your author's note, because I know it wasn't a really straightforward decision for you, well, about the inclusion, but also about like whether to have a glossary at the back. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, of course. So the initial drafts, I was not going to provide the glossary
Right.
of the Navajo words. I was not going to provide any resources, largely because that was my experience of the Navajo language as a kid on the res. I myself am not fluent in Navajo. I am learning. I'm teaching myself Navajo, but as a kid, like Navajo language was kind of the adult language, the secret language.
Mm-hmm.
So my parents, my mom and my stepdad would always kind of like, if they wanted to like have some saucy comments to each other, like would go into Navajo. Or like if I remember when I first admitted that I was having suicidal ideations and was put into a hospital, my mom and my grandma, while they were waiting for me in the hospital, in the same room with me, like they just started talking in Navajo. And that really kind of frustrated me, because it felt like, again, it was very exclusionary that I was feeling. So I wanted to mirror that experience in the book of like having the Navajo just bam, here it is, and not having to provide a context of it. Part of how I was going to navigate, quote unquote translation, was even though I wasn't going to provide the literal translations of it, I wanted the emotional intensity of those moments to be intact. So one thing I did kind of towards the beginning of Healer was, if Nali spoke in Navajo or Nathan was speaking in Navajo, the translation would be immediately provided thereafter, or at least like the emotional energy would be communicated. And then towards the end of the book, those translations are gone. So that way, like if you were picking up on like saying, oh, yate means hello, then towards the end of the book, like I don't say hello, or I don't provide the English translation of it. It's just yate in its form. And hopefully you already understand what that means. But even if that's not the case, like you get the physical reaction of the characters while they're speaking Navajo. So even though the literal translation is not available, you have those emotional contexts to be able to understand, like, okay, this is a serious thing that's happening. This is something that's, you need to kind of like absorb. And that was largely, again, like my experience with the Navajo language. Like I would always kind of pick out cues of like, oh, they're talking about something serious, or oh, they're having a secret love language, or stuff like that. And I remember my email from my editor, after I'd submitted the first draft or the final draft. She was like, okay, Brian, let's start working on that translation list and the glossary. And then I emailed back saying I wasn't preparing to provide a translation. And like, we got into this big conversation, and ultimately what convinced me to provide the translation was she said, young Navajos might find value in having this translation. If they're learning their language, it will reinforce their learning journey. And I had to let go of a lot of my pride. I had to let go of a lot of my artistic integrity, or whatever you want to call it. And like, yes, this is first and foremost a book for Navajo kids. And if this is a way to help them learn their own language, I'll provide it. And that's when I started working on the translation list.
It's interesting because I know you were in the author note, you talk about how part of it was about kind of the colonizer mindset about having to make the Dene culture transparent to non-Navajo readers, which relates to also I was really interested when you were talking about like the sacred element of the story, because of course they are dealing with holy beings, and that even you who are Navajo had to be careful about which ones you talked about, which stories you referenced, um, because this is something very sacred, and you consulted with a lot of different people to make sure, is it okay if I do this? Can you talk a little bit more about that and kind of how you navigated what to include and what not to include?
Sure, of course. Well, with a lot of traditional Navajo stories, the Navajo, there can be any amount of restricted knowledge or restricted versions of stories or just restricted stories in general. Like right now, we are in the middle of winter, which is one of my favorite seasons because it's so amazing what happens on the res. We go into like keshte or shoe games, and we have like ketlo or I'm not sure ketlo or kloche, string games, and like we tell ma'iba and that coyote stories. And these are only things that we can do during the winter. And part of that is shoe game was originally played by a lot of animals that hibernate in the winter. So to order to respect them and their contributions to the world, like we don't play shoe game outside of winter. And string games are very spider related. Like Spider Woman taught us how to do string games, or I guess in the Lagana in White World, it's called like Cat's Cradle.
Right.
So to respect spiders and like how they taught us how to make our own clothes, we only do it during winter. And coyote stories, again, deal with a lot of animals that hibernate during the winter. So we tell them when they're sleeping, not when they're awake, because coyote stories kind of make fun of them. So it's always a gesture of respect. And a lot of other restricted knowledge is like you cannot talk about it outside of ceremonies. You cannot talk about things outside of hogans. Because, like, again, ceremonial knowledge is about healing a patient. So when I had admitted that I was feeling thoughts of suicide and I was having suicidal ideations, part of my journey towards emotional well-being was I participated in a ceremony. And I had to call out and recount some of the stories that my mom was telling me as a kid. And I was always wondering, like, why did we do that? Like, why did we tell the hero twin stories? And after the ceremony had been concluded and I was able to kind of like talk and everything, my mom explained to me, like, when you were retelling that story, you became the protagonist. And that was just such a powerful moment of realization. And just hearing that you are the protagonist is it was very powerful. It was very affirming. It told me that I existed, that I mattered. And so while the hero twins were overcoming the monstrous enemy, you are overcoming your depression. And there's a lot of stories that are in that vein, in that mindset, in that philosophy of if you share this, if you write this down and repeat it, you are going to dilute that story's ability to heal. And a lot of the holy beings are in many different ceremonies. And so this is kind of why I chose like darkness and holy beings as darkness and wind being, is because they're kind of everywhere. Darkness is always half of the earth at least, and you know, wind is everywhere. So I felt like if I were to represent any of the holy beings, those two would probably be the least provocative. And I said my prayers to them. I asked for their I asked them for permission to represent them. But yeah, there's just so many ways that these stories interconnect. And so it was very, very dicey and challenging for me to be like, is it okay to represent this story? But in my initial drafts, like I didn't shy away from including all of the stories and all the details of Nda or the enemy way ceremony. But then when I was revising, that's when I started taking things out and saying, all right, these I know for sure I cannot talk about. So I took them out. And that's when I started reaching out to medicine people to say, like, is it okay if I reference this in this way? Like, I want to be able to have the impression of healing through these actions, is it okay? And sometimes I would say no, sometimes I would say yes, but if any one of those, I mainly consulted with 4 medicine people. If any one of the 4 major ones said no, then it was gone. Even if the other 3 said it's okay. Um, and a lot of that is also very emblematic of like the entire Navajo Nation. Like we're not one huge amorphous consciousness. Like we have different variations of the stories. We have different restrictions in different parts. Even different families have different versions of the same stories. Right. So I wanted to be aware of that and respectful of that. So I kind of left space to say, if your stories are different from the way that I'm telling it, like ask your grandma why, ask the medicine people why, because that's where a lot of the lessons are when you interact with medicine people saying, why is this happening? Like, why is this different compared to something else I've heard? And that's where all the lessons are at.
I love that it's, I mean, it's interesting because in a way you're referencing this oral tradition of stories, but you're also kind of helping them pivot back to the oral tradition again, you know, that there's still going to be that personal, and you're saying, okay, now read the book and then go talk about it. You know, that there's that continuity.
That's what I'm hoping for.
Not an either or. Yeah. Well, so I know we're coming up on time, although I feel like I could talk to you for so much longer. This has been such a great conversation, but I want to be respectful of your time. So maybe just to close, you could tell us what's next for you. Do you ever think that these are going to become a film? Are you working on a 3rd book? What are you working on now?
It is my goal to eventually return to the film world with these stories. Like part of my long-term goal with Healer of the Water Monster was to publish it as a book, demonstrate that there is an audience, and have the power to produce the story the way that I wanted to, and not have to bend over backwards to film executives. But I have 2 more books in this series. Since the first 2 books are male protagonists, I want the next 2 books, the last 2 books, to be female protagonists.
Awesome.
And so 4 is a very sacred number in Navajo culture. And for me, Healer was always east. Heroes is south, and the next 2 are going to be west and north. And so right now I'm currently working, I'm taking a breather from the Water Monster stories because I want to kind of brainstorm a little more about these next 2 books. Like the first 2, I knew what I wanted to write about so very much that I needed to tell those stories. So the next 2, I kind of want to find that same spark. I have ideas, but for now, I'm working on a YA book, so a little older audience. So I was very fortunate to attend a boarding school in the East Coast for my last 3 years of high school, and I was one of 2 Native American students, and that was a very weird experience.
Right.
So I'm writing about a young Navajo boy, Navajo res guy, sophomore, going to one of these elite boarding schools, but also discovering that his great-grandmother was a survivor of the boarding school era when, you know, the United States government kidnapped our elders and forced them into save the man, kill the Indian policy.
I cannot wait for that. Do you have an idea of when that might be out?
I'm working on the revision right now. It's the most emotionally challenging thing I've written so far. It's slowly turning into my goodbye love letter to my grandma, who passed away last year. So like, I'm always crying at the end of my writing sessions and feeling like just, I think it's good for me to find a place to kind of express my grief for my grandma, because we were really close. But yeah, hopefully if I am successful in finishing a revision, minimum a year and 3 months, maybe maybe a year and a half. So usually it takes about a year from when the final draft is submitted and accepted by your editor to be fully published. And I'm currently kind of sort of almost at that final draft submission.
Well, good luck with it, and I can't wait to read it when it comes out. And of course, we'll share about it in our stories when that happens. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Time of the year, so I appreciate that. And thanks to everybody who's joining us. If you joined us late, this will be the full interview will be up in just a few minutes on Instagram and later on our YouTube channel.